So an enjoyable part of my day job the last 30 years or so has been every other year or so teaching trademark law. And from that perspective, what you talk about as brands is something much broader than what the law protects as trademarks. At times, reading through the paper, I was wondering what exactly you mean by brands. Sometimes you were talking about, the designation of the product itself, or how that was positioned alongside the what I think of as the brand, the mark, the trademark, the legally protected aspect of it. And I'm wondering, what are the implications of that disconnect between what you see as the capital asset, the brand, and what is legally protected under the trademark laws? Is protection inadequate? Maybe protection is more than is needed. You talk about which is very interesting, about the role of consumers in building up the meaning of brands, which suggests that, that can be problematic from a trademark perspective, but maybe it suggests that less protection is appropriate in order to be sure that these co-creators have the freedom that they need in order. So I'm just wondering what you think about all of that, and maybe that was your last slide that we went over very quickly. From your perspective as somebody who looks at branding as a corporate practice of capital formation, do we have too much or too little, or the just plain wrong kind of legal protection? It's been inching upward. The scope of legal protection has been inching upwards, I think, as branding has become more important and more valuable. So the boundaries have been expanding. Is that the right move? Is that the wrong move? Can you say a little bit about the role of legal protection in this?
And also, you had that antecedent question about, what are brands?
Yes, that's true.
And I think you're quite right that a brand is far more comprehensive than what we typically think as the trademark, right? So the symbol for the Virgin Group, that Virgin logo, that is not the brand in total. That is a component of the brand. Because the brand, really what makes the brand valuable is the network of associations that are in people's heads about the meaning of the brand and about their willing to purchase the services of the provider. So I just want to make it absolutely clear that trademarks are only protecting obviously a highly valuable component, because the brand name is probably the hub of that network of associations, but it is not protecting the brand in toto, and of course firms have to rely on other means to try and protect their brand capital. On the second subject of trademark protection, my perspective really hasn't been a normative one of do we need more or do we need less. It's been more one of a positive one. Trademarks exist. Trademarks are a form of capital over and above what the brand name is itself. It's obviously a legal instrument that entrepreneurs combine with a whole range of other technological and marketing practices to protect their investment. I think it's kind of interesting. I think on the one hand, it's clear that the trademarks are improving in protection and increasing the value of the residual control rights that trademark owners have. On the other hand, we're also observing a much more diffuse set of de facto rights over the use of brands. In other words, the kinds of things I've been talking about. So I think it's going in two different directions. Increased legal protection combined with increased distribution of the de facto economic control of trademarks. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Can you give an example? What do you mean by de facto control? What are you talking about there?
Well, the kinds of activities that we're seeing in online brand communities, it's the brand communities that have more control over the development of the brand in some cases than the legal owner of the trademark.
Although that can be conditioned by legal rights also, right? You could recognize or not a
yes.
First Amendment right to have that activity.
Yeah. I probably have said enough for now on that subject, but I'm very happy to talk later on that.
Fascinating. As an economist interested in innovation, I find this presentation extremely fascinating. I will not touch about IPR or other things. I want to ask you a couple of questions. I think your focus on brands also focuses on a key new area on innovation and demand. It's not the supply but the demand side. Because, and I want to know your opinion, in a sense, brands are a way to identify new segments of demand, new type of preferences, new aggregation of consumers. So in a sense, in this way, it is an innovation and switches the focus on demand. And I want to know, this is the first question, if you think this is a way to go to identify a new relationship between innovation and demand. The second question is, you have been very stark in say brands are innovation. Well, I've been working a little bit with trademarks and patents, of course, as well. And you know that all not trademarks are innovation. And therefore, not all brands are innovation. As a firm has a lot of products, a large firm has a lot of brands. How can you identify if a brand is an innovation? I'm willing to buy, I'm not studied brands, but I'm willing to buy that not all brands are innovation. A lot of brands are just maybe product differentiation by companies. So why are you so stark in your definition of brands are innovation? And how can you identify, is it because they have increased the sales of companies, because you know that they have identified new preferences within demand, or whatever?
Addressing the first part of your questions, really, I would just say yes. There's no doubt that brands place much more emphasis on the demand side component of the entrepreneurial process, but not demand in the sense of passive consumers, demand in the sense of creative consumers. And I think that, so it's really questioning in some respects, or it's emphasizing the interlinkages between supply and demand much more so than the conventional approach where it's the supplier who makes everything available and consumers just make a buy or not buy decision. On the second part of your question, I think it's not so much that I'm saying that brands are innovation, it's really because I'm taking a much broader conception of what innovation is to begin with. In other words, I'm prepared to see innovation in much more incremental, much more modest, much more pervasive kinds of economic changes. In other words, I'm not saying that these have to be heroically innovative objects. I'm prepared to actually see innovation at a very microscopic, incremental scale. It's clear now, to say that does not mean that all brands are going to be successful. Clearly that they're not. And obviously it's only from the perspective ex post that we can identify particular kinds of branding strategies as being really innovative, like paradigmatic examples of innovation. But from my point of view, I think that all branding does involve some component of innovation in that it's involving some reshuffling, however marginal, of the capital structure of the firm. But it is it's a much more modest conception of innovation in that sense.
And not necessarily a kind of strategic move by companies that do not involve any innovation, because you may have a kind of entering different product spaces. Is this one correct? Yes. So I'm saying innovation and not strategic behavior by firms that do not include any type of innovation.
So yes, here again, I'll keep my comment very brief. Innovation, in my view, doesn't have to be a deliberate strategic decision. It could be decisions that are made on the fly in the process of doing other things. It could be a byproduct of trying to do other things, and branding changes occur as firms try to change what they're doing.
Right, these tired old eyes can't read name tags across the table, but you're right, I'm not right. My reaction in reading I'm going to make more of a comment than a question. My reaction in reading this was that I've seen this before in a different way. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, in the 1960s, there was a pair of books by Vance Packard called The Status Seekers and The Hidden Persuaders. And we discussed it in high school, like these psychological things that are being done to us to force us to buy various products and all of this stuff. And the idea was that the product was simply toothpaste, for example. And all this other stuff that you're calling branding is just a form of manipulation to get us to buy one kind of toothpaste versus another kind of toothpaste. Then there was a reaction to that, especially, and that's related to, you know, Chamberlain's monopolistic competition and all those ideas. Then there was a reaction. I remember George Stigler talking about advertising, and he had a very, you know, branding, advertising, very similar. He had a very interesting view. It was just conveying information, okay? So then somebody raised their hand and said, well, you know, Marlboro Man, I mean, why, how does that convey information? I mean, it's just a cigarette, right? Marlboro Man. His answer was this: you have to entertain people to get their attention. So he gave the example. He said, suppose I had a butcher shop, and I just put on the window of the butcher shop, G. Stigler, butcher. I said, would people care? Would people come? Well, of course, you know, people knew he was going to be a Nobel Prize winner. Maybe they would have come, but in any event. Okay, so the thing is this, that there is this thing in economics still, I think, that branding is simply, as Franco was saying, a kind of a strategic thing to get you to buy something whose characteristics are not changed by the effort to get you to buy. And it seems to me what you're saying is that these efforts to get you to buy, so to speak, are really changing the characteristics of the product, right? And that's something that neither side of that debate previously, the Stigler side or the Vance-Packard side, saw. They both were thinking about a product that was simply what it is, and it was just a matter of whether it was information or manipulation. That's my comment.
If I could just make a very short comment about that. First of all, that literature that you identified really did see the consumer in a relatively manipulable, passive mode that responded to what producers do. The perspective we're taking here is that no, it's in fact, it's the customers who have more power. They're as creative as the companies themselves. They are producing advertising content in social media. And secondly, yes, it isn't just that the brand is a way to tailor the product to manipulate people to buy. The brand has become a distinct entity. It transcends individual products. It endures longer than they do. It can withstand and survive past technological trajectories.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about this notion of communicative capital as a brand. I mean, this sort of, if you look at the microeconomics of this, in terms of information economics, the standard story is the problem the brand solves is a consumer problem of quality recognition, right? And the standard answer then is it creates a reputational hostage such that I wouldn't risk my reputation unless it was quality. So it's solving that problem of one-way communication, the firm with the consumer. But there's another problem that consumers face is what is this? And this is a problem that's unique to new goods. A new good comes along and it's, oh, what is this? I don't even know what this is. And in that sense, a brand is also solving that problem by positioning it. But what's interesting is that isn't necessarily the firm communicating with the consumer. It's often a group of consumers coming together and deciding this is windsurfing, right? It's not stand-up yachting, it's windsurfing. And tying it to that thing. And then the firm then forms around that brand identity with the product space. So I think there's the sort of two very distinct stories, and your thing seems to be the second one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm obviously familiar with the traditional or an economic view of trademarks and brands as being means of more of a signaling object which firms use to ensure quality. But the problem with that conception is that it sees consumers as already having an idea about what they want. They already know what qualities they want. It's just a question of finding it and establishing that what they have found matches what their previous template was. What we're dealing with here is a much more open-ended, a much more fluid kind of set of interactions between consumers and firms.
Two comments and one quick question. The first one is I like the reference to What We Do in the Shadows, which is a great New Zealand movie. The Woody Allen's movie Midnight in Paris does the same thing in opposite. He's in the past and he says, I'm going to get ibuprofen, and nobody knows what ibuprofen is, which is interesting. The second comment is there is no... it seems to me that Kerzner's discussion on advertising maybe should be somewhere in your paper and in your presentation, because Kerzner puts it in a way that he says advertising is neither signaling, neither information communication. I mean, it's all of that, but it's more precisely a way of presenting information in such a way that consumers cannot fail to notice the existence of the product. So it relieves consumers from being their own entrepreneurs in some ways. And it seems to me that going off what Mario said, what Jason said, what Franco said, that theme is there, and maybe that would be good. But my question has more to do with in management, brands are seen as having value in themselves, and you presented it very well. But I have to say that sometimes I'm very uncomfortable with this view, because it's pushed to such an extent that it seems that brands are floating abstractions that have nothing to do with the capabilities and specific assets that firms have that originally produced those brands. And we see examples of that all around us all the time. Maybe you guys know a company called GoPro, which makes those small cameras. GoPro is in the toilet right now, even though its brand was phenomenally valuable just 2 years ago. But the products they're producing now is just outdone by competition. There's many other firms that make smaller or just as good cameras, cheaper, and so on. So it seems to me that the whole discussion of whether brands are in themselves capital that is disconnected from the specific assets that companies may have sometimes goes too far off the planet. So I'd like to know if you have any view on this.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this from a philosophical point of view, actually, in terms of immanent realism and Aristotelian and Platonic abstraction and all of that. But however, getting it down into more easier ways to describe, look, brands cannot exist disembodied from some material instantiation. So although they are abstract to the extent that they transcend an individual product, they are still instantiated in sequences and series of products of any firm. So they transcend the individual product range, but they still are instantiated in some sort of physical medium. So, I mean, the irony is that brands were invented essentially to protect products, but as you've described, what happens now is that a brand needs good products in order to survive, and a bad product can destroy the brand. So brands have become quite fragile. They have this quality of, on one hand, being quite robust to certain kinds of changes, and on the other hand, being very fragile for product failures. Just take Volkswagen and Samsung Galaxy Note 7 battery failure. So there's no question that brands are impacted by products.
Would you be willing to extend the idea of brands beyond the realm of commercial production to political branding? We have national flags, we have national symbols. Some of them seem to be totally arbitrary, but once they're associated with people's minds and with certain things, they become either inherently attractive or, like the swastika, inherently evil. But in a way, there's nothing specific about brands that doesn't, can be contained into a much larger literature of our need for for symbols, many of which are quite arbitrary. There is nothing inherent about the difference between a swastika and, say, a Magen David that makes one of them bad, one of them good. I mean, this is just the way these things are configured in our mind. And I think, in that sense, brands is is a subset of a much larger set of, things that semioticians talk about all the time.
Yes. So there is a lot of work that goes on about the branding of nations.
Yes.
And And also regions within nations. If we're talking about Champagne, for example, we're talking about geographical indications which have a branded quality to them. Presidential candidates have a brand, as we're all very familiar with it. The approach we're taking here isn't limited to an individual product offering of a firm. It has implications that go much wider than that.
Yes, I've been wondering about the power of brands. Certainly brands help to differentiate product from competition, but I'm wondering also if brands do promote or protect or control innovations. Certainly they protect the secrecy of their innovation. And certainly when we look at Microsoft, is a big brand, and they've been trying to protect their coding and so on, and they come in conflict with institutions like the European Union and so on. But the power of their brand is so great that they manage to protect and maybe control and not promote innovation.
Yeah, I don't have a specific response at this point.
Okay, but thank you very